All right, well, wonderful. Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about your book tonight. I was when I saw the cover, and then I saw there was Patricia's publishing house that was putting it out. I thought it'd be a great chance for the Bangor Public Library to kind of highlight you as a Maine author. And so many people are interested in rural living and farms and everything these days. I thought it'd be a great program to host. So.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And a little bit about what Jenny wrote is being born the daughter of a surgeon does not necessarily make you a surgeon, but what about being the daughter of a farmer? What happens when a childhood and on-the-job training are one and the same? In Jenny's new inquisitive and humorous collection of essays about growing up and raising a family in rural Maine, there's little doubt that memories and the stories they inspire to continue to guide and shape her throughout life. Jenny's going to talk about her collection of essays in her book, Freedom Farm. It's an investigation into the authenticity of family lore and a meditation on the nature of memory itself and how it changes over time and how we are changed by it. And I present to you Jenny Neves.
Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Neves. I wrote Freedom Farm. This is a nonfiction essay collection. Thank you to the Bangor Public Library for hosting me tonight and giving me the chance to talk about this. I guess it's going to be a casual talk. I'll give you an overview of kind of what I anticipate. I'm going to start with a short reading, and then we'll take breaks for questions to keep things moving and make sure nobody gets bored. And I'll give an overview of who I am and why I wrote this and where the inspiration for the essays came from. Before I start reading, I guess the one thing to know is that even though you can sit down and read this book in maybe one sitting, that the essays took about 7 years to write. I started back in 2013 and 14. And, so there's an evolution in terms of the writing and the topics. And, there was an evolution of me as an author and, what was happening in my life. And so as I do these readings, I'm going to kind of pick and choose a little bit from the first part of the book, which takes place in Freedom, Maine, where I grew up. And then, read a little bit from my young adulthood. And then the last reading that I'll do is from pretty recently here in Palermo, Maine, where I'm now raising my 4 children. So without further ado, I'm going to start with an excerpt from an essay called The Bees and the Pinto. The Bees and the Pinto. On the farm, there was never too little time to fit in a quick chore. Each of our fields, those with beans, corn, alfalfa, and potatoes, was separated by a windrow, a 10-foot thick row of trees and brush. These were places the old rock walls used to sit, and sometimes still did, buried beneath the overgrowth. One year, Pa decided to clean up a section of one of the windrows on Easter morning. Clean up is the sort of casual phrase my father would use to make the task seem more reasonable. If he had informed my mother that he intended to use a blowtorch to incinerate a 40-foot section of bramble in the 20 minutes before leaving for church and a family gathering, she wouldn't have taken quite so kindly to the idea. It was no secret that my father's distaste for family gatherings was unparalleled. He would argue that he'd just seen these same relatives 5 months earlier. What could they possibly have to report in such little time? While we kids loved visiting cousins, we were also well aware that the moments prior to a scheduled departure rarely passed without incident. For our father, the words family party elicited immoderate ambition and insufficient caution. Just out of earshot of our mother, he nonchalantly suggested that we should quickly slip into our work clothes and grab some matches. Matthew, the youngest and unskilled in the art of covert operations, made no attempt to hide from our mother his delight at the prospect of a good fire. For her part, my mother continued readying herself for the party, holding out hope that this time things wouldn't spiral out of control. Pa started up the tractor and let us ride behind him, our feet balanced on the back edge of the winch as he rolled to the spot needing work. Thick brush was knotted at the base of an old rock maple, looking like a rat's nest, something our neighbor had once said about my uncombed hair. Dry grass grew below the dead limbs, its yellow stems looking stiff and thick like cigarettes. Matthew begged to be the one to light it. Pa said we were just going to burn a few spots, thin things out a bit before church. He let Matthew do the honors. It burned just how Pa said it would. The mess was gone and the rock maple looked stronger standing alone. Pardon the dog. Since we still had 4 minutes, Pa hooked the winch to a downed tree, one that was big enough to cut into firewood. The tractor bucked its approval as the chain drew tight, pulling the thick trunk like a splinter from beneath the brush. One of my older brothers dragged the tree back toward the house while my father lit the blowtorch to ignite the scrub. We all watched as the flames climbed higher, higher, then jumped. I looked quickly to my father's face. He was thinking. He turned to my 2 older brothers, the boys. Run to the barn, get rakes, get shovels, get a bucket of water. He looked at Matthew and I and said, "Go get Mom." I don't remember, but it's likely that our mother was already on her way out the door. She had a sixth sense about our father's diversion tactics, especially when fire was involved. Though he'll never admit as much, I think he knew that she was always the one exhibiting the appropriate level of concern in tight situations. I wonder if he might have fallen in love with her for this very reason. He must have known that successful child rearing would require at least one parent capable of experiencing fear in potentially life-threatening scenarios. While our father battled the flames alone, the boys gathered every tool we had, dragging half a dozen rakes and shovels toward the mayhem. Matthew and I arrived shortly thereafter, our mother in tow. The alfalfa field, dry from a winter's exposure, was glowing orange in too many places to count. The flames had jumped right out the windrow and started to spread in waves. Smoke billowed up into our faces, our lungs burned, and our eyes sprouted tears. We pounded the breaking edge of the fire with our shovels, raked dirt to snuff its spread. My father splashed the tree line with water, hoping to protect the woods. We were frantic as flames surrounded us, the heat singeing the hairs on our arms and our faces. When the fires were finally out, we stood, spread across 3 acres of open field, looking at each other, our clothes black from ash and soot, our faces flushed or burned pink from the heat. The fight had lasted for almost an hour. We waited silently for 5 minutes, maybe 10, to make sure the fire was really out. We waited until Pa yelled, "Let's go." We hurried to the house, put on our Easter clothes, and drove into town. I have no memory of the ride, but I wouldn't be surprised if we sat in silence the 30 minutes it took to reach my Aunt Jackie's house. There was an unspoken sense of accomplishment, an energy coursing through the 6 of us that hadn't been there before. I remember the feeling, the buzz of adrenaline that escorts a day well lived, a story worth retelling. My father is the type of man who stacks these kind of days one atop another, seemingly without intention. He lives ferociously, and I wonder if this is what drew my mother to him so long ago and keeps her by his side. That Easter, we missed church, but we made it just in time for lunch with my mother's family. When we walked into the house, noses turned, aunts and uncles stared confused. My father's eyebrows were gone, his forehead noticeably longer. The boys and I had crispy yellow lashes. Matthew's face was covered in pink and gray splotches, and Mum had Band-Aids on her fingers. We stood before my mother's family like criminals on trial, a paroled gang of arsonists come to dinner. So that concludes my first reading. Lay down, Julie. And I will say, that seems a great place to start kind of describing where I came from. That was our life. It was crazy. We were a little bit feral. Bad decisions were made sometimes, but we always laughed about them. And I thought it was a good place to start. Just, I grew up in Waldo County, grew up in Freedom, Maine. And I went to high school at Mount View, and I then decided to do my undergraduate at the University of Maine. And I studied biochemistry and molecular biology. And, a lot of writers that I know come to writing from literature degrees and English degrees. And for me, writing was always a very practical thing. I was writing reports, and I was writing lab documents and technical documents. And that's the way it stayed for all through college. And then after college, I decided to join the Peace Corps and marry kind of the two things that I was good at, which was farm related things and science. And I became an agriculture volunteer. And I was doing some experiments with seed varieties in West Africa. And I came home and stuck to labs. I was a lab rep for about 7 years. I worked in a biodiesel laboratory. I worked in an environmental laboratory, and then a pharmaceutical laboratory. And after about 7 years, really felt like I was not being fulfilled. Those were jobs that I could do and I could do well, but I wasn't happy in those jobs. And so I decided to quit my job, sell everything I owned. And my now husband, Nathan, and I left the country and traveled in Southeast Asia for 6 months. And we had no plan and made a lot of mistakes. And that was the impetus for me to really start writing. I ended up writing that journey down and creating my first book, which was Backpack Like You Mean It. And I spent about 6 months when we got home writing that book. And it was a real test for me to see if I had what it took to sit down every day at a desk and write and, stick to the editing and really learn the process. And I was able to parlay that book into being accepted into a graduate program for writing. So every step was kind of getting me closer to finding out what my passion was and how I could work that into my everyday life. And so I joined a 3-year MFA program at the Rainier Writers Workshop in Tacoma, Washington, and got to work with some amazing mentors, people who, taught the craft of writing, people who were able to, very well read, could give me great advice for where I needed to go to kind of take the next step in my writing. And, one thing that I was really encouraged to do was to think about storytelling in a different way. I had growing up, we told stories verbally. A lot of the stories in my book in the first part are stories that I was retold. And, they carried meaning, they carried sort of family values and really sort of taught me about who my parents were and how they started. But, in graduate school, I really was asked to think about what more is there to stories? How do you draw people in? How do you get readers to really care about what you're writing more than just for a laugh? And I don't know who asked me the question. It was a mentor of mine who said, when you go to a party, what are the stories that you tell? What's the story you tell about yourself so that people can know who you are and know a little bit about how you grew up, or, know who you are as an adult? And then why is it that story that you tell? And that really got me thinking about the nature of stories. And that was the birthplace of Freedom Farm. Because at that time, I had all these stories from my childhood, ones that I remembered because I'd been told a million times, or I loved to hear them. And so I would ask my parents to tell them again. And I started to really try to put those into categories. Why was I so drawn to certain stories about who my parents were or about who our family was? And so I think I will jump now to I'm gonna read from another part of the book, sort of in the middle of the book, which were essays that I started to write after starting to dig in and ask some more intriguing questions about the nature of story. And maybe before I do that, Candace, we could take a quick break. And if anyone has any questions so far, I could answer a question before doing another reading. And you're on mute, Candace. There we go.
I had to find my mouse. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. I loved listening to that story. I remember a few little burn the dead grass in the field stories of my own. So it's wonderful. Do any of you have any questions or comments for Jenny while she's taking this little bit of a break?
And I will say, for anybody listening on Facebook, feel free to jot questions down. I know there's also a YouTube channel for the Bangor Public Library. And as I'm speaking, if anything pops up, you're welcome to leave it in the comments section and Candace can pass it along. All right, well, there's a question. All right, in writing a nonfiction collection, do you use journals to help you remember what happened? How do you remember everything like that from your childhood? That's a great question. So, this is nonfiction, but it's a creative nonfiction. And I think it's important for people to kind of know what that means. I think sometimes there's a little suspicion about authors who have too many details that, who could remember what a sunset looked like on a certain day in a certain year, 20 years ago, right? But I will say that the creative part of creative nonfiction for me is, a lot of these memories, I do not have journals that talk about them because they were stories passed down. And I didn't write the stories that my parents told me. I just heard them a lot of times. And what I try to do in my writing is be really honest about when I'm stepping into that place of being creative. So using cues in the writing that are, I imagine this is what it might have been like, or I like to think that this is how this was. I try to use as many of those cues as possible so that readers, you can build a sense of trust with your readers and they know where you're coming from, which is a place of wanting to create the same feeling that those memories create in me. And sometimes you have to add some detail. And even though, I may not remember what a sunset looked like on a particular day, or even the time of day that something happened, the memory for me has a feel to it. And I'll just write what that feel is and put in the details that try to portray that same feel. And I will say, though, that during the writing of this collection, I did use photographs as a cue for my writing. There's one essay that talks about a photograph of my mother. And so I looked at that photograph and, brought up feelings for me, brought up stories. And so I was able to use, some hard things as clues for how to get the story on the page. But the other thing is that this essay collection started 7 years ago. So the stories from a long time ago, yes, there's a lot of imagining, but there are stories that were written as recently as 6 months ago. So those I'm just writing because they're happening. And I think they almost are my journal to, be living these things and jotting down notes and then creating the essays from those experiences.
It's interesting that the idea about using a photograph to help, spur those memories and probably color photographs too would help, Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And, as part of one of my, I think my thesis, project for graduate school was to collect all of my family photographs that inspired memories for me. And I ended up scanning them all. And in that process, really went through and jotted down notes about, certain stories and places. And it really sort of helped me flesh out the memories with a little bit more detail. Well, if we have no more questions, I think I'm going to hop to another reading. And this next excerpt is my first foray into animal husbandry. It's from an essay called The Second Sort. And here we go. The Second Sort. One fall morning, I looked on Craigslist for goats. I'd been thinking about goats for 2 or 3 days, which had been sufficient time to convince myself that I would make a very fine goat farmer indeed. I pictured myself milking them and then making cheese with the milk. They would be gentle and playful, and I would brush their fur when it became matted so that it might remain pristine for shearing once a year. I would be spinning by that time, well practiced and efficient as I transformed our crop of wool into yarn. My husband may have heard me musing about goats, but didn't take me seriously for any number of reasons. He wasn't much for idle chatter about animals we didn't own and work we didn't know how to do. He's very practical in that way. He went off to work that morning, waving goodbye, pecking my cheek, assuming that everything would be pretty much the same when he returned that evening. As soon as he was gone, I hopped into the car with his younger brother, Tyler, who I'd met only a few times before and who was visiting for the week. Tyler seemed pleased to be on a covert mission, one that had the potential to disrupt his brother's equilibrium. We drove for almost 2 hours, farther and farther into the Washington countryside. When we arrived at the muddy drive of a family desperately in need of fewer animals and more space, my hopes began to rise. A young girl who may or may not have been licensed to drive jumped into a pickup and asked us to follow her to an off-site enclosure. When we arrived, the pen was empty, a fact that might have discouraged the fainter of heart and more sensible. For me, the distant ringing of alarm bells was an invitation to proceed. The goats, which were presented as an unverified pygmy breed, had escaped and run half a mile into the woods. The salesgirl, apparently unfazed, led us to the spot she thought they might be grazing. Sure enough, there they were. 5 or 6 of these horrendously matted creatures, whose physiques I would later learn make them impossible to milk. The young girl had a bizarre conviction that the only way her goats would be happy, the 2 she had for sale, was if they were sold together. I chose not to inform her that, despite my sincere interest in these animals, I was neither equipped nor inclined to concern myself with a goat's emotional well-being. They were both female, a mother-daughter pair, and I was so intoxicated by the idea of cheese and wool and the genial relationship I imagined myself having with these animals that I didn't balk. I offered to take both, as though it had always been my plan. I dislike admitting it, but it seems obvious now that the little sales shark was more talented than I gave her credit for. I can say with certainty that these goats were not happier together. She, on the other hand, was likely much happier, having rid herself of not 1, but 2 of these miserable creatures. In my mind, there are 2 types of farmers. Those who spend countless hours obsessing over the imminent arrival of their domesticated charges, and those in whom the reality of animal husbandry does not strike until the moment their newly acquired pygmies jump from the sullied trunk of a 2-door Honda Civic. I am the second sort. I often tell myself that this chronic lack of preparation is related to my sense of adventure, a joy-seeking impulse. But upon putting it to paper, I feel pressed to admit a certain level of laziness. My father, a far shrewder farmer than I, used to tell me that necessity was the mother of invention. And though it was likely not his intent, the old proverb instilled in me a poor habit of waiting for necessity. And I will jump ahead a little bit in this essay and read a bit more. Tyler and I reluctantly put ourselves to the task of shoving one dank and fetid body after another into my two-door Honda, hoping the newspaper I'd thrown down earlier would be enough to soak up any moisture. For the record, it wasn't. The mother of the pair, a graying bulge with 4 black limbs that kicked at irregular intervals, was irascible beyond reason. In an attempt to illustrate her displeasure, she removed a sizable piece of foam from the passenger seat when the opportunity to do so presented itself. Her daughter was darker, slightly less tousled, and far more aggressive. As we wrangled them, the girl tried half-heartedly, after all we'd already paid in full, to assuage our budding apprehension. The trauma of changing owners was a latent in life adoption, she offered. We needed to give them time to adjust. With a little hand feeding and soft talk, we'd be on our way. As we drove off, the girl mentioned in the most casual way possible, the goats might be pregnant. A 2-hour drive hadn't seemed important on the way out, but the return trip was excruciating. The goats bleated angrily the entire time and relieved themselves on multiple occasions. I could spend the next 50 pages explaining all of the things that went wrong with these goats during their tenure in our makeshift pen. In summary, they hated me and so were not willing to be milked, sheared, or coddled in any way. Their fur was disgusting, their attitudes were worse. Even so, my husband, though quite surprised and far less affected by the whimsical imaginings of what raising goats could be, was supportive of our new hobby. So I will take another break there and say that, after this essay, the book sort of starts to shift to my adult life. This is one of the last essays before I started our family. Now we've got 4 children. And, I think it's clear that I'm not a farmer, certainly not good at animal husbandry. We kept the goats for a couple of years, but no longer have goats. As I started moving into the writing of my life, starting my own family, I started to ask the question, if I'm not a farmer, what will my kids have to hold on to really structure their childhood around? Because many of my childhood memories are related to the cyclical nature of farming, the certain chores that happen in the spring, the things you do in summer, you're weeding, you're rocking, in the winter we were sorting beans. And a lot of my memories are attached to those activities. And so I really started to think, without farming, what's our family structure going to be like? And how are we going to pass along our values? What stories are my kids going to want to tell when they get older about their childhoods? And so I think, those questions are sort of what inspired some of the later essays about my own children and their personalities, and really digging into who they are and who we are as a family on our land in Palermo. Palermo is the town over from Freedom where I grew up, and we have land, but the only animal we have right now is our dog Tulip and a bunny. And we're not farming anything. I like to tell people that I'm farming people because I'm growing 4 small children into adults. But I think that's a bit of a stretch. But anyway, I guess I'll take a pause again and see if there are any more questions from the audience before maybe doing a final reading from later in the book. Do we have any other questions, Candace? Oh, you're on mute again there, Candace.
Sorry about that. We've got a few people watching on YouTube. Any questions over there? Let me see. How about this? Yep, got one here. How would you describe the overall tone of your book?
Okay. I guess I would, what I hope that people would get out of it is maybe delightfully dysfunctional or pleasantly dysfunctional. Every family has those strange things that make them unique. And for me, Freedom Farm is really a celebration of those things. Our family tends to be a glass half full type of family, I think. And so, there are many stories in this book that written by someone else might have seemed traumatic or upsetting, but for us as a family, a lot of these adventure stories, it goes back to that ferocious living. And in order for a day to feel well lived, our family sort of needed that charge of something exciting, something unexpected. And so I guess, what I would hope is that people can read this and sort of feel that celebratory tone, and really appreciate that, I am appreciative of my own upbringing and am trying to share. And maybe I would hope that people would feel a little bit nostalgic for their own childhood and some of the original things in their own families. And, possibly would hope that it would inspire people to think about their own stories and maybe what their own stories say about them and say about their families.
Yep. There's one other one. And what do you think your readers will come away feeling when they've read your book?
I guess I can't predict that necessarily. We all come to reading a book with our own insights and our own experiences. And what I hope people would feel is maybe that nostalgia for growing up, and a little bit of the wildness that comes with being young and being allowed to experiment and do crazy things. And maybe, people who didn't grow up rural, it might be interesting to sort of see how a family that lives out in the country and has the privilege of doing different things, like letting your kids, run off into the woods and disappear for a couple of hours, what that's like. It can feel pretty foreign, I think, for people who are not familiar with that, to imagine the kind of upbringing that a country life affords.
Mm-hmm.
That ties in sort of to my final reading.
We have one more question.
Sure.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah.
Yep. On YouTube, Abby Boone, was there ever an age in your life where you considered big city life?
There really wasn't. I am really uncomfortable in big cities. Growing up, we took a couple of trips when I was young, maybe to Boston. We visited an uncle in Virginia. And while those trips were always really exciting to me, I just can't let go of needing the space, having the freedom to be able to go out into your backyard and know that you're not going to bump into anybody. Nobody's going to be watching you. You have the freedom to do and be what you want. And I think especially when I started my own family, I wanted that for my kids. I wanted my kids to be able to disappear in the woods and build forts and be accountable only to themselves, and be able to really fend for themselves and develop those skills of independence and confidence that come with, for me, that came from being out in the country and having a lot of space and independence to grow and learn by myself and with my siblings. So I guess, no, I never did. I know my husband dreams of someday going to a big city to live part of the year, but I won't concede to fully moving to a city anymore because the country has too much allure for me. Yeah. Any other questions, Candace? Or
not right now. No.
Okay. So I'm gonna do one more reading. And this reading is from the end of the book. It's about my son Jack, and really gives a flavor of kind of how all of this has sort of created a parenting style for me and for my husband, and how we view our own children and their experimenting in the world. And this is an excerpt from an essay toward the end of the book. It's called The Pond. And let's see if I can find it. Okay, The Pond. In the spirit of cultivating a kid who approaches struggle with gusto, Nathan and I make a point to engage in experiments we are quite certain will fail. As long as they have a fun factor that speaks to our sense of the absurd, we'll go along with just about anything for a little while. One of my favorite of these experiments was Jack's 2-month obsession with capturing night crawlers. These are especially long and elusive worms, ideal for catching fish in ponds that allow live bait. Jack began asking anyone who would listen for their hypotheses regarding the most effective way to catch these worms. From me, he got the simplest and most straightforward answer: dig for them. And while, like most 7-year-olds, he appreciates a good digging project, my answer didn't have any elements of danger, risk, or farm boy ingenuity that he was looking for. So he did what most of us do when we're looking for answers that responsible people won't give us. He went to the internet. With Allie's help, Jack made a list of methods for coaxing worms from the dirt that did not require nearly as much effort as digging. Over the course of a few weeks, we learned some pretty foolish methods of unearthing these things. First, grunting. There is no level of explanation that would compare to the confusion and delight one might experience if they were to stumble upon a 7-year-old grunting for worms. To grunt for worms, one must hammer a stick into the ground. Jack tells me it's best if it's driven 6 to 7 inches deep, but I hesitate to take him at his word. Like many firstborns, he speaks with complete confidence, regardless of his actual knowledge in any given situation. Jack spent the better part of a week hammering sticks into our yard before I noticed something was afoot. I happened to step out onto the back patio to grab my sweater from the picnic table when I spotted him with a hose watering a rather barren spot of dirt in the upper field. My policy is typically hands off when I notice a child doing something strange, quiet, and harmless. However, I do draw the line at frivolous water usage. So on this day, after about 30 seconds of observation, I can't help myself. Jack, why are you watering the dirt? You can turn it off. I'm ready to grunt. He yells this with nonchalance. He doesn't even look up to get my reaction to a new term. Grunt, I yell back, staying calm and feigning only mild interest while turning off the hose at the spigot. Come see, the night crawlers are going to wiggle right to the surface. Of course, I'm now very interested. I've passed the point of no return in what is sure to be a cockamamie plan, and there is no use trying to hide it. As I approach, I can hear the melodic clucking of wood rubbing against wood. Jack has used his handsaw to flatten the end of the stick he hammered into the ground. Feel free to take a moment to quietly pass judgment on the safety of allowing a 7-year-old to use a handsaw, while I mention that we are also the type of parents who let our kids do increasingly dangerous things with sharp tools if they prove they can do it responsibly. With another stick, he is rubbing the flat head of the stake so that it vibrates the earth beneath the surface. What's that supposed to be doing? I ask, trying and failing to hide a smile. The vibration causes the worms to come to the surface, he explains. They don't like it. It makes them afraid that a mole is digging toward them, and they try to escape by coming up out of the dirt. I find it extremely difficult to imagine a nightcrawler feeling afraid. I find it difficult to imagine a nightcrawler feeling much of anything. But I stand and I watch Jack make those sticks hum for about 15 minutes, while he assures me that worms will be showing up any second now. A reasonable person might give grunting a shot once or twice before determining it was an internet prank. Jack, on the other hand, hammered no less than 50 sticks in various locations around the property. Maybe the worms liked the soil around the compost. Maybe they didn't hang out in the shade. Maybe the ground needed to be watered so they could slip more easily to the surface. I watched him grunt for days in every possible iteration of this activity. He never saw a single worm. When the sting of the failed grunting wore off, Jack went back to the internet and found an even more impressive tactic. He came into my upstairs office to pitch the idea. Do you have a 12-volt battery? He wasn't going to give up the plan all in one go. Why? I have another experiment to try. That's a car battery, buddy. That's some serious juice. I know, but I'll be careful. You going to jumpstart some night crawlers? I had him smiling with this comment. I had myself smiling. Jack could sense my mood was good, so he went all in. No, but kind of. I need a battery to hook up to 2 metal poles that I'm going to hammer into the ground about 2 feet apart. When the electricity goes through the ground, the worms don't like it, so they come to the surface. On this particular day, I was in a yes mood. I also knew that I didn't want any part in electrocuting worms. Thankfully, I knew someone who could almost certainly be persuaded to take part in this activity: my father. My kids call my father Happy instead of Grandpa or Pops. It was a nickname that started with the first grandchild and for some reason stuck. I looked Jack straight in the eyes and said, "I'm not zapping worms with you, but I know someone who would probably love to try something as insane as that." I kept my eyes locked on his and waited for him to come to the same conclusion I had. It didn't take long. "Happy, he'll do it. Let's go to Gammy and Happy's house. Can we go there for dinner?" Jack was buzzing now. He started collecting all of the things he needed for an afternoon with his grandfather. When we got to my parents' house, a short drive from our own, the smaller kids went to play in the living room while Jack ran to the workshop to convince Happy to get a battery and some metal rods ready. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, I see the two of them in the backyard, hammering metal pins into the ground with a sledgehammer and hooking the truck battery up to them with jumper cables. They spent 45 minutes moving the pins closer, watering the dirt, revving the engine. Nothing worked. When my dad pretended to electrocute himself and let out a blood-curdling scream, we all laughed, and Jack knew the experiment was over. So that seems like a good place to end. And I suppose if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Before I do, I'll say thank you again to the Bangor Public Library and to Candace for hosting me tonight. It was great to be able to share my book and to tell you a little bit about myself and our life here in Palermo. But please feel free to ask questions or hang around and say hello.
I did it again. We do have another one on YouTube. It says, read your last book as well. This is from She Can Build It. I don't know who that is, but that's her handle. And after all these worldwide adventures, what brought you back to Maine, so close to the farm where you grew up?
That's a good question. I think it goes back to wanting to raise my kids with some of the same experiences that I had growing up. It's not going to be exactly the same because I'm not a farmer, but we do have the land, and we also have the ability to go back to my parents, to their house, and have my parents do these crazy experiments with my kids, which I would not do. And so in a way that allows me to give my kids a little bit of my upbringing through their grandparents. And we get to create our own life here in a way that's a little bit different than how I grew up, but shares so many of the things that I treasure about being rural and being a Mainer. And I really hope that my kids feel the same sense of, sort of passionate protection of that rural upbringing that I do.
Oh, that's great. I wanted to also let you all know that I've put the link to the Briar Patch bookstore, where online link for Jenny's book in the chat box. So if you want to see that, it's right there. And I think.
Yes, I will mention, to support local bookstores. The Briar Patch is in Bangor, Maine, a great little bookstore. There's also a little shop called the Maine Variety on Route 3 between Augusta and Belfast that carries my book. And of course, you can get it directly from North Country Press in Unity as well. You can get it online, but it's great to support, local businesses too.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that, Jenny. Well, if there aren't any more questions, or if you have anybody have any, you don't have to have a question. You can just talk to Jenny if you'd like. Please feel free to do so. And
hi, Mary. Hi, Anthony and Fisherman. Thank you for coming.
Can you hear me? I have a question.
Okay, sure. Yep, I can hear you.
So what stories do your children now ask you to retell about your life in either Freedom or in Palermo?
That's a good question. So I with 4 kids, they often have conflict, and they love right now hearing stories about how my brothers and I had conflict and how it was resolved and who was mean to who and how the dynamic happened. And so I have 3 boys and a girl, and I grew up with 3 brothers. So I relate to my daughter in that way. She's always asking me questions about how to deal with 3 brothers. And so right now, a lot of the stories are more about siblings than about, I guess my parents or, me in particular. They're more about the dynamic.
Yeah, thank you for that, Anthony. Question.
Well, great. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the reading, and thanks for asking some good questions.
I did very, very much. And it is a remarkable thing to be able to raise your children in a rural place where they can just go and play.
Yeah.
It really is. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Look forward to having some more programs being announced for the rest for summer starting in June. So stay tuned. Information will be coming out on Bangor Public Library's website and our social media platforms. So Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you. Are you going to have a link to the YouTube? Is there a link to the YouTube channel so that if someone missed it, they could share it? Perfect.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to go in and get that all cleaned up, set up, and I want me to send the link to you and I can put it.
Please, that would be great.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you all. I can send it to the people that registered for tonight's program too.
Great. Thank you so much, Candace.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.
Good night.